Anita Klute will be chairing this phase. I just want to make one remark. There's a photo of myself on Facebook. I don't know who took the photo, but I see it. I've got a mic. And that photo was taken in Williston, in the Northern Cape. And at that conference, I was with Professor Anton van Niekerk and Danny Brink from agriculture. Today, I remember that day when I stand here with Prof again. Welcome, Prof. And
good morning, beloved. It is well with our souls. And it's my privilege this morning to introduce to you somebody that you most probably know. Obviously, he was part of university for many years. He says he was 20 years a professor in the Department of Philosophy. That's his subject. And he was also the chair. Prof, was it for 20 years? Phew, now he must be tired. 20 years the chair of that department. He was also the director of the Center of Applied Ethics here at Stellenbosch University. But it's interesting, he also got 2 degrees in theology, a BTH and a licentiate. So he's at the right place. I mean, philosophy and theology, they go together, right? Obviously, as academic, he's written many books. He was involved with 22 books as editor and co-editor. He's written 180 peer-reviewed articles. But what we most probably in public knows him for is the popular articles that he writes. There are almost close to 400 of those he's written. You would see in the Burger, is it Tuesdays, Prof, that you write? Yes, I also go to the coffee shop on a Tuesday for that one. So he's written there. And then he's also played a leading role in several ethics committees in Africa. He was a founding member for 15 years, also the chairperson of the Board of Ethics Institutes of South Africa. And then, obviously, he was an NRF, still maybe an NRF researcher or a rated researcher. And most of his books, popular books, is written in Afrikaans. Geloof sonder sekerhede, wat in 2005 gepubliseerd is en it was republished in 2014. Die dood en die sin van die lewe. I think that's an interesting one, Prof, especially after that death of that person that we've reflected. I think you also wrote a piece on I forgot his, Ian, I think was his name. And then the whole thing about we don't only live for ourselves, we live actually for each other. And then the other one is rationaliteit en relativisme. I think dis een wat ons nie kan oplees nie. En meer onlangs een in 2005 is uitvlug in die skemer op die markplein van idees. So we really have somebody here that's got his foot deep into his field. And Prof, we really feel honored to have you with us today. Sorry that we disturb your retiredness, but we welcome you in our midst. Please, let's give him a hand.
Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, I think of with nostalgia back to my days when I studied here. We said to each other in those days, we had to study for 7 years to be dominees in the Dutch Reformed Church. We said to them, this is a quick school, but it is not a quick school. It is not a quick school, eh? Our chair has indicated that that I normally reside with philosophy. Somebody once asked, what is the borderline in Stellenbosch between theology and philosophy? What is the borderline? And the answer is simple. It's Victoria Street. On the other side, it's philosophy. This side, it is it is theology. Thank you very much for your very kind invitation. Also, Mr. Dean, Reggie, my good friend. Nice to see you here. Okay, so let's get going. Let me say, after this wonderful devotion that we had, what I have to offer you reminds me of something like moving from the sublime to the absurd. So I'm sorry about that. If you experience it as absurd, but this is the kind of stuff that I can do. I don't know so much about the rest. The term ethics and/or morality refers to a specific characteristic of human behavior, namely the universal human phenomenon that our behavior as humans is not something that occurs spontaneously or instinctively. We don't just, like the animals, glare at each other and jump on each other, and so, without reflection on what is happening. All human behavior is or can be submitted to what I best might call the claim of obligation. In Afrikaans het ons 'n beter woord daarvoor. Die behorenseis. Think of that. Die behorenseis. Die feit dat al ons gedrag is onderhewig aan 'n behoort. Die behorenseis. The claim of obligations. I'm not aware of any culture that does not operate within the ambit of some ethos. By the Greek term ethos, I simply mean character or custom. That's the way the Greeks used it. It refers to the fundamental spirit, guiding beliefs, or moral values that characterize a community, a person, or an ideology. The term is generally used in philosophy, sociology, and persuasive communication. That simply means that it is always legitimate to ask the ought question with reference to human behavior. Right? We must ask always, that is what ethical behavior is about. The response to the ought question, die behoort vraag. The ought question. We do not simply act spontaneously in response to some physical or emotional impulse. We are, in principle, obliged to act in one way and not in another. This disposition, more than anything else, is what distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom. Animals can be, and often are, adorable. But they, like us, act. Their behavior is never subject to ethical scrutiny or evaluation. The phenomenon of ethics primarily entails that blame can be expressed and bestowed on humans that act unethically. Blame. That's a key concept in ethics. We can bestow blame. That does not apply to the animals. Blame is only appropriate when bestowed on human behavior. Our moral or ethical identity, in this sense, significantly entails and expresses our human identity. In this lecture, I will make a few additional conceptual clarifications of the concepts at play in this topic. You must bear with me, please. This is what I do as a philosopher. I analyze concepts. I try to help people to clarify complex concepts. But then I will continue to discuss very broadly some historical trends in the occurrence and applications of ethics since antiquity, followed by remarks about the rebirth. And that brings me to my title, to the rebirth of ethics that occurred in the course of the 20th century. I will conclude by referring to some trends of concern that we are noticing in the first quarter of the 21st century that threaten the continued institutionalization of ethics as a fundamental marker of civilized behavior. Hence my reference in the title of my talk to what I call the threatening demise of ethics in our time, because that is what we are seeing around us. We are seeing a really troubling breakdown of ethics in our time. Now, let's start at the beginning. Let me firstly try to clarify key concepts that will be used henceforth. First of all, morality and ethics. I am one of those weird birds who believe that they don't mean exactly the same. I think it is useful to distinguish the concept morality from the concept of ethics. The term ethics is derived from the Greek word ethos that originally meant character or custom. It is, as far as I'm concerned, useful to distinguish the notions of ethics and morality. Morality refers to actual human practices in the world that are informed and guided by values, such as the generally preferred and legally enforceable practice that people should not drink and drive at the same time. In as far as this practice occurs, it is part of morality as a tangible, almost visible phenomenon out there in the world. When you walk through a supermarket and you don't steal from the shelves and you pay what is due to the business, then we are seeing morality. That is morality in action. It's almost visible. Morality refers to all those identifiable aspects of moral or ethical behavior. Ethics, on the other hand, is by and large a philosophical discipline. Not everybody will agree with me on this, but I'm willing to defend it. Ethics is by and large a philosophical discipline that is the outcome of a systematic and rationally justifiable process of reflection about right and wrong or good and bad. Ethics is, whereas morality is what we do in relation to the question, the response to the ought question. Ethics is what we think we ought to do, right? And what the basis for doing that is. Ethics, to put it differently, is what we are engaged with today in this lecture. Morality refers by and large to that which we reflect on when doing ethics. In short, morality is what happens in fact when people behave and so on. Whereas ethics is what they think they should do and how the latter is reflectively and systematically motivated. The different ethics theories, and note I say ethics theories, not ethical theories. A theory can't be ethical. People are ethical, or theories are ethical, but not. Morality is what people in fact do when they believe they, whereas ethics is what they think they should do and how the latter is reflectively and systematically motivated. The different ethics theories that we encounter in ethics literature, like deontology, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, etc., are then the outcome of the reflection that ethics entails. Ethics, as I say, is a reflective activity. It's not engaged with something that we see, it's engaged with how we think we should act, I now move on to make a few remarks about the way in which ethics has been institutionalized historically in Western civilizations. Ethics has, since earliest times, been theorized but also practiced. Western culture, as we know, emerged from a historical movement which we call the Greek Enlightenment. That is the period more or less between 400 to 200 BC. This period encompasses the lifespans of the founding fathers of the Western intellectual tradition. And those founding fathers, as we all know, are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Everything intellectually worthwhile in Western culture, I'm not talking about other cultures here, in Western culture, everything worthwhile is in some way or another derivable or refers back to these great figures. Of the three great pioneers of philosophy and ethics, it was Aristotle. Aristotle is the most important part when we talk about ethics. It was Aristotle, the teacher of Alexander the Great, whose thinking had, through the ages until today, the most influence and impact. The scope of his influence is proven by the fact of the re-emergence of virtue ethics, of which he is the universally accepted champion in the course of the 20th century. It is, for conceptual clarity, worthwhile to note the differences between the moral theories of Plato and Aristotle. I do find that an enlightening explanation. For Plato, ethics essentially consists of, note, the knowledge that emerges from the contemplation of the idea of the good, which is the highest idea in Plato's acclaimed hierarchy or realm of the forms or ideas. That is, metaphysical constructs that are vaguely reflected in things that we observe in the world. When we observe things in the world, we have a vague memory, or what Plato calls an anamnesis, that's a memory, an anamnesis, of what these true essences really are, as they exist in the realm of the forms or true reality. The highest of these true or real forms in Plato's inventory is the ideal ideas. Ideal ideas is the idea of the good. For Plato, the ideas find themselves in a hierarchy of importance, and right at the top, the most important idea of all others is the idea of the good. The idea of the good. Whatever can be called good must, in other words, refer to or constitute reflections of or participate in the idea of the good. Now, very important, this means that ethics for Plato is essentially a kind of theoretical knowledge. Very important. Plato's idea of ethics is the outcome of the contemplation, already before we are born, might I add, the contemplation of the idea of the good. This idea of the good, of course, was later overtaken by particularly St. Augustine and applied to the Christian God. Applied to the Christian God. We are not there yet. Plato's famous pupil, Aristotle, disagreed with him on this fundamental point. He disagreed with him. For Aristotle, ethics is not primarily theoretical knowledge, as we just said, but ethics is practical knowledge. That's the big difference between Plato and Aristotle. Ethics is practical knowledge. Aristotle develops this observation by means of his notion of, bear with me with these Greek words, but this one is important. I say Aristotle develops this observation by means of his notion of phronesis, which can be translated as practical, deliberative knowledge. Phronesis, key concept in Aristotle's ethics. Well, this practical knowledge is quite distinct from the kind of practical knowledge that we acquire when we learn to fix motor cars or computers. Phronesis is practical knowledge of how to lead what Aristotle calls the good life, how to lead the good life. But what the good life is, and this is the intriguing thing in Aristotle, what the good life is distinctly different from a working computer or a mobile telephone. In fact, the good life, though we all seek it, is far from the same for everyone. That's the intriguing thing about the good life. What is the good life for me and the good life for someone else is not necessarily the same thing. The good is a purely theoretical entity. The good life is the life precipitated by applying universal moral norms to practical needs and situations. It therefore takes the content and nature of practical life and problems and situations much more seriously than does Plato, for whom the good is a purely theoretical construct. Aristotle is therefore accused not only Aristotle is therefore focused not only on theory, but on the question, how do we apply theory to practical needs and situations? Put differently, Aristotle is interested not only in the ends that reflect the good, but very much also in the means by means of which we attain the good life. One could therefore also say that for Aristotle, the good life is a knowledge of both means and ends. It is a knowledge of both in the sense that our choice of an end will strongly influence the means that we apply in order to reach that end, and vice versa. Let me give an example. If my end in life is like for Mother Teresa, to relieve the plight of the poorest of the poor, if that is my end, then Aristotle says, I choose means that will serve that end. I don't venture into develop the latest issue of Microsoft software, as in the case of Bill Gates. If the good life of Bill Gates is to develop the best recent computer technology, then you must choose means that serve that. So the end of what people regard as the good distinctly influences the means that we choose in order to achieve that end. Most importantly, also for the topic that concerns us at the moment, phronesis or prudence is a kind of knowledge where I try to act in accordance with precepts or action guides that I acknowledge, but in such a way that they are prudently applied to the situation which I find myself and where I must act in a way that I can live with the consequences of my actions. That application requires what Aristotle calls deliberation. You know the term deliberation. A rational interchange that moves to and fro between the requirements of the norm and the requirements of the situation. Richard Bernstein formulates it as follows. Phronesis is a form of reasoning, he says, and knowledge that involves a distinctive mediation between the universal and the particular. In this idea lies the genius of Aristotle's insight into the practice of phronesis. Aristotle writes, and I quote, "Prudence is not concerned with universals only, it also takes cognizance of particulars, because it is concerned with the conduct, and conduct is always a sphere in particular circumstances." The crux of my argument is to be found in this last sentence. Here he formulates what might be called the essence of moral knowledge. Moral knowledge respects and often builds upon the norms and action guides that pervade social life. We inherit these action guides from our education, our religion, our conscience and our conventions of society. However, merely drawing on deep-seated norms and conventions is not enough. These norms and conventions require application in a host of practical situations. Exactly how they are to be applied is far from self-evident. That is something that we learn in the practice of daily life. It does not occur overnight. It takes time. We learn it in many ways. The way that Aristotle particularly emphasizes is the way of deliberation. Let's again look at a quick example. What does it mean to be courageous? Courage is one of the great moral values. What does it mean to be courageous? Well, for Dirkie Uys, those of you who know Afrikaner history, what was courage? Courage was to stay behind when the commander, of which his father was the chief, fell into a trap amongst the Zulus. And Dirkie Uys stayed there, defended his father at all costs, even if it eventually cost his life. So courage means, in that situation, the willingness to forfeit your own life for the sake of your fellow human beings. Compare that conception of courage to that of Viktor Frankl. You all know Viktor Frankl? What is the name of the famous book that he wrote? Man's Search for Meaning. Do yourselves a favor and read Man's Search for Meaning. Frankl was an inmate of Auschwitz in the Nazi time. And he knew very well that the purpose of the Nazis was to work him, like the other prisoners in that camp, to work him to death, right? To death. Eventually, they want him dead, but in the meantime, they'll let him work so hard that at least they also get something out of it. Right? Now, what was courage to Frankl? Frankl said to himself, whatever happens, these bastards will not kill me. Courage in that situation means the willingness, right, to do everything possible to prevent them from killing you. Dirkie Uys didn't mind getting killed because that is what was appropriate in his situation. You see what I mean? I use this example to explain to you that ethics has to do with the application in practical situations of universal norms. Courage is a good thing, but what does it mean to say courage is a good thing in the situation of Viktor Frankl and in the situation of Dirkie Uys? And it's two completely different things. This is one of the intriguing things about ethics. About ethics. It's not the same in every situation. Now, I have deliberately spent some time on Aristotle's notion of phronesis as practical knowledge because of its influence in the tradition and its re-emergence in the course of the 20th century. You might ask yourself, what is this professor into this morning with us? What I want to impress upon you is that Aristotle is a hugely influential thinker, particularly also in the way in which things panned out eventually in the course of the 20th century. In the history of Christian theology, to get nearer to your interest, the source of moral guidelines or principles was understood differently from Aristotle. I'm not for 1 minute saying that Aristotle and Christianity think in the same way about ethics. So they were understood differently from Aristotle, despite the enormity of his influence later on. For Aristotle, the source of moral principles was the outcome of the dialectical interaction between the Platonian norms or ideas and the force of human deliberation. In Christianity, on the other hand, drawing on the Judaism of the Hebrew tradition of the Old Testament, the source of moral authority is the law or the Torah, the law or the Torah, as was captured in the laws of Moses. What enters the fray here is not the force of dialectical deliberation, but of an all-authoritative and powerful lawgiver, Yahweh or God, who calls Moses up with him to the mountain and gives him the law. This is what you should regard as your driving force for moral behavior. Morality henceforth attains the structure of, note now, what is morality in the Old Testament? Of an all-authoritative and, morality henceforth attains the structure of obedience and attunement to God as the ultimate lawgiver. Christianity, and this is now a step further than Moses, Christianity, in the figures of Jesus and St. Paul, translates the main tenets of morality into the life of faith. The life of faith becomes the source of knowledge. The life of faith, in which the identity of the Christian faithful resides and finds identity. The salvation that Christian faith aspires to is a salvation mediated by the life of faith. The moral life that Christian believers aspire to is the life of faith, the life of devotion and gratitude for God's graceful and merciful act of redemption, reconciliation, and the justification of sinners. We live morally because of the renewed identity that God bestows on believers through his merciful act of salvation or reconciliation, as demonstrated in his incarnation, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. The moral life of Christianity is the dispositions named by St. Paul as faith, hope, and charity, of which charity is the greatest, says St. Paul. Charity, however, is not founded, like in Aristotle, by the dialectical interaction of norms and practices. Christianity is, in the end, both a command and a gift of God through the work of the Holy Spirit. This constitutes the essence of the Christian conception of morality that gradually superseded Aristotelianism and Platonism in the Middle Ages, as the Middle Ages progressed. And this then brings us eventually to modernity. Modernity and the notion of morality identified by modernity. And again, when I use the term modernity, I refer more or less to the period between the years 1600 and 1900 AD. 1900 AD. The context of the modern Enlightenment, as developed and propagated by the founding fathers of both modern philosophy, that's René Descartes, and modern science, which is Galileo Galilei, paved the way for the emergence of a new framework for institutionalized morality and ethics. This goes back to the first half of the 17th century, during which time both Descartes and Galileo lived. The moral precepts that became prevalent in this time were founded upon ideas that were increasingly less based on the metaphysical precepts of the Middle Ages, when the idea of an authoritative Godhead acted as a moral lawgiver. The important difference from the Middle Ages was that this authoritative lawgiver was increasingly replaced by or understood as the outcome of rational insight and argumentation. See, that's the big difference between modernity and the Middle Ages. Rational insight and argumentation. must ground our insights into the norms according to which we should act in modernity. Modernity is the era where the difference between right and wrong morality was increasingly seen as a response to the question, what is the right thing to do? This question was answered with reference to the arguments of the exponents of the great modern moral theories, such as deontology or Kantianism, that you might know of, and utilitarianism, that you might also know of. Deontology is the theory that propagated the application of moral rules as the basis for morality and ethics. The Ten Commandments is a typical example of a deontological view of ethics. It lays down rules according to which we are supposed to act. The greatest of the modern deontologists was Immanuel Kant, who insisted that the difference between right and wrong action is the expression of deep-seated rational intuitions. Deep-seated rational intuitions. Such an intuition is expressed, for example, by the acclaimed categorical imperative. You might have heard of the categorical imperative of Kant, which reads, act in such a way that the precepts according to which you act must be accepted by all moral agents, or act in such a way that other people always are regarded as ends and not as means. So for Kant, the important thing about morality is moral rules are applicable that everybody, that will be universally accepted in society. Importantly, what bestows moral status on actions for Kant is never a metaphysical lawgiver, but the persuasive insights of reason. Above all, what is ethics? How must we understand it? What is the basis for ethics? That which is given to us by our reason. Reason becomes the great lawgiver in modernity. Another highly influential modern moral theory is utilitarianism. You will know very well, I hope, about utilitarianism. The brainchild of thinkers such as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. They propagate utilitarianism as the ethics theory which dictates that the most persuasive moral action is the one that maximizes overall happiness for everyone involved, while minimizing suffering. It is based on the principle of the greatest good for the greatest number, and judges actions solely on their consequences or their outcomes. You want to know whether an action was right or wrong, look at the consequences. They are the only things that matter, the consequences of the act. And if the consequences are good, then the action was in order. The action was in order. Again, utilitarianism, note, is a secular theory. It does not draw on the authority of an authoritative lawgiver. It rests fully on the assumption that we are all able to rationally establish the balance of good over bad when asked to make moral judgments. It is a radical theory which has all sorts of counterintuitive implications that I can't discuss right now. The most important problem with utilitarianism is its futuristic orientation. Moral status is, for a consistent utilitarian, wholly determined by the positive balance of happiness over suffering as can be predicted. The past, or what has happened before, has no bearing on judgments about moral status. There is, for example, no persuasive reasons why promises ought to be kept if keeping them produces more unhappiness than happiness. So utilitarianism is the kind of moral theory that is applicable, that says if it is in every respect to the detriment of a newly born, these serious problems and issues, and he will not live for long, and so then it is quite in order. If you look, in other words, at the consequences of what is going to happen, it's quite in order to let him die. Quite in order. That's a typical utilitarian position which is very popular in medical ethics circles nowadays. These approaches to moral reasoning provoked a lot of criticism and resistance in the course of the 20th century. This gave rise to the tendency, propagated particularly in the sphere of analytic philosophy and championed by thinkers such as R.H. Hare and A.J. Ayer, to relegate the grounding of ethics entirely to the sphere of personal preferences and emotions. Hence the term emotivism for this kind of ethics. Now, we are now seeing what is happening to ethics in the course of modernity, the course of the 20th century. Two developments followed in this respect. The first was a famous article by an Oxford philosopher with the name of Elizabeth Anscombe, in which she strongly argued that the relevance and status of ethics can only be restored if the dependence of ethics and moral reasoning springs from the acceptance of a moral authority or absolute authoritative lawgiver. Anscombe's point is that ethics faces demise exactly because the Christian conviction of an authoritative lawgiver is forfeited in modernity and replaced by claims to a radical subjectivism in terms of moral reasoning. And the second development is closely associated with the ideas and influence of a thinker called Alasdair MacIntyre, who has had a very strong influence on my own thinking. Arguably, the most important moral philosopher of the 20th and early 21st centuries. In his classical work, After Virtue, he argues persuasively that the moral crisis of our times is by and large caused by the veracity of the disquieting suggestion or hypothesis that in the actual world in which we inhabit, the language of morality is in a state of grave disorder. You want to be persuaded of why the language of morality is not helping us a lot nowadays. Do read MacIntyre. And his point is we nowadays have greatly lost our ability to make substantive moral claims. We cannot do that. It becomes more and more difficult to say this is right and that is wrong. Because if you say it, then a utilitarian jumps up and says, well, that depends. What is the greatest balance of good over evil in this situation? Or a deontologist jumps up and says, but this does not conform to my conception of the notion of rational rules. What about if different rules do not coincide or are at loggerheads with each other? It becomes more, and then the emotivists to which I've just referred. The emotivists are the people who tell us, well, actually ethics is only about our emotions. It's the articulation of what we prefer. You get preferential ethics in that sense. Preferential ethics in that sense. So we have greatly lost our ability to make substantive moral claims. What we nowadays, in the modern age, possess, says MacIntyre, is no more than what he calls simulacra of morality that we inherited from a conceptual scheme that has lost its coherence and authenticity in modernity. This feeds into a disposition that effectively makes it impossible for us to continue making substantive moral claims. We continue to use many of the key expressions of an alleged moral discourse, but we have lost very largely, if not entirely, our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality. The insights of Anscombe and MacIntyre are indicative of the very real crisis that morality faces in our world. Since particularly the advent of the 20th century, we have seen the threatening demise of morality. That brings me finally to my title. We have seen the threatening demise of morality. The 20th century produced 2 world wars, the greatest catastrophe in history. And I think of the 2 world wars as one war, right? They were just, the 2 parts were separated by 20 years. But for the rest, they were actually one war. And that's the greatest catastrophe that we've ever seen. Think also of the thrashing of moral values in events like the Korean War, the rise of apartheid, the Vietnam War, the conflicts in Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Iran. Think also of the more individual yet reprehensible ethical crises, such as the actions of serial killers and sexual predators, the Jeffrey Epsteins of our world. Think of the instances of poverty and unemployment and the cruelty and heartlessness of the ruthless crime that pervades our society, particularly currently in this very country. I'm at the point where I don't want to listen to the news anymore. I mean, it is just, people are murdered on a daily basis in their 10s, if not in their 20s. I don't know what's going to happen here. I've not even spoken about the corruption and all that stuff. Think about the suffering of those who have to live with the consequences of climate change on our environment. That is something that the church has hardly spoken on. Some churches have. But let me assure you, climate change is one of the greatest potential catastrophes that we are facing in our time. All, in the last instance, caused by human moral failure. Whenever one nowadays opens a newspaper or watches a TV news bulletin or movie, particularly in this country, you are confronted with a harsh reality of the demise of morality. Despite all the grand theories about moral behavior that have been discussed earlier in this lecture. Is there a way out and a semblance of a chance that a rebirth of authentic morality and ethics is possible? Let me conclude. I'm sorry if I've overstepped my time. Let me conclude by drawing your attention to the notion of rebirth, as also used in the title of my talk. Because of time and space constraints, I will settle for pointing out the ideas of moral rebirth proposed by Alistair McIntyre, to whom I have already referred in talking about the threatening demise of morality in our time. The most important thing we learn about morality from Aristotle, as explicated by McIntyre is deeply influenced by Aristotle, is that the most important question in ethics is not what must I do, but the most important question is what kind of a person must I be? What kind of a person must I be? That is a move from typical modernist, deontological or utilitarian theory to virtue ethics. Virtue ethics. What kind of a person ought I to be? In other words, what is the nature of virtue? And how do I realize that virtue in the way that I live? McIntyre, as has been shown, is hugely skeptical of the way in which modernity conceptualizes an outcome of the disquieting suggestion that he identifies. For McIntyre, modernity, of which Hobbes, Kant, and Mill are the champions, is a project that had to fail. Why the Enlightenment had to fail is a famous chapter of McIntyre's book, After Virtue. The reason for this is that modernity has abandoned, now this is the crucial point, has abandoned the fundamental moral scheme inspired by Aristotle in terms of which the project of morality makes sense. And this scheme has three components or fundamental assumptions. If we want to think morally, we must think in terms of this scheme, which is not happening anymore. The three components of the scheme is, first, man or woman as he or she is. That means a conception of human nature. We must have a conception of human nature. Second, man as he is supposed to be. That is the telos of humankind. Yes, we must have an idea of what we are, but we must always also have an idea of what our destiny is, what our telos is, what we are to become. And then thirdly, the moral precepts that enable us to move from one, which is the anthropology, to two, which is the telos. Two, which is the telos. The implication of this suggestion is that morality is impossible or incoherently understood if humankind does not have a central goal or destination, and a self-understanding in terms of such a goal or a destination. Modernity, or the Enlightenment project, wishes to emphasize the importance of a notion of what we are and moral precepts of those two. But modernity, the problem with modernity is they have no teleology. They have no idea of what their destination eventually is. That causes the moral scheme of modernity to become incoherent and ineffective. Whosoever wishes to pursue morality without the idea of the telos, ends up as an exponent of the nihilism of Friedrich Nietzsche, the thinker who vehemently argued that alleged moral precepts are entirely of our own making. For Nietzsche, man is the measure of all things. Man is the measure of all things. Forget about the telos. As a Catholic Christian, this is unacceptable for McIntyre. We are moral in as far as we pursue our God-given telos. Hopefully, we can reach a stage when this will be possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof, for the lecture. So we still do have about between 12 and 15 minutes for questions. So what I would like to do is, Prof, can we take about 2 questions per?
Yeah, if I can remember that.
Yeah, well, I'm here with you, I will try to. So they must keep it as simple as possible, right? Don't give a speech, just ask a question. Or if you want to make a comment, just say that. Someone will assist, you will assist us with the roaming mic? Okay, so can I have, by show of hands, indication who want to ask a question for the first round? Yes, another philosopher. There, I see your hand. Another hand. I see 3 hands. Okay, do we have it now for the first? No, you must just go the mic. So you can ask later. So we will start here, and then we will go to the 2 people here that raised their hand. So Hercules, right? Yes, let's go with you. Just offering the mic.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Niekerk. Thank you for the enlightening lecture today. As you might already anticipate, the question we get to speak about afterwards is, why didn't you mention Hegel? But we will speak about that afterwards. My question is about And the problem that I have with him is that it seems like he forms these almost caricatures of, the Greeks, and the Greeks were the good guys in the Middle Ages, and then the modern philosophers lost the plot. So we need to return to that virtue ethics structure. But it was something quite problematic in the application of virtue ethics in the Middle Ages, as we know. It was a sort of performative, the purgatory system in the Catholic Church. Now, we do see the phenomenon today of what we call virtue signaling. So this is once again a sort of performative, a performative virtue, and you get clicks for performing some things. People, give you, or you get social capital by these performances, but most of it is not deliberative. It's very, just focused on getting clicks. And how do we think about this phenomenon of, or the problem that McIntyre puts on the table? We lost virtues, but now it seems like we've got it back. And some people are even saying we're going back to feudalism economically again, which for someone that is nostalgic about the Middle Ages is not a problem. But for other people, it might be a problem.
Okay, I was on the verge of. Okay, so we will take another 2 questions.
Hi, I'm Mark. Hi, thank you for that. I'm just struggling with practical application. So you sit with a situation where we're looking at, we're guided by our telos. Sorry, that's me. Sorry. Wait. So I get your argument, or rather McIntyre's argument about our telos and acting our guiding for as far as ethics and virtue go. But and you started right at the beginning again, and with saying my telos might be different to somebody else's telos, and for McIntyre's obviously our understanding in relation to God, and so I can do that within my community, within my congregation. How do I then speak out against somebody whose telos is clearly miles away from that, and does all kinds of havoc across the face of the planet, but feels they justify?
Thank you so much. Must we stop there, Prof? For now, we will come back to you as the first question, right? Okay.
Well, to start with the second question, one way of going about that is to work towards a consensus. But what McIntyre has against is the idea that we can function, we can operate without a telos, irrespective of what. Of course, the telos is not the same for everyone. Not the same for everyone. Incidentally, about McIntyre, I heard a nice story about him the other day. He's a professor of philosophy at Notre Dame, the Roman Catholic University in North America. And he was asked whether he's an atheist. And so his answer was, yes, I'm a Roman Catholic atheist. Roman Catholic atheist. So, I'll have to think about that. But it seems to me inevitable that if we say we have a telos, then at least we must take traditions seriously that do that. And that's what attracts me to Christianity. Because Christianity makes it clear that we have a telos. Certainly our understanding of that telos is not exactly the same. It's not exactly the same. That's why we have, incidentally, theology. Because theology is the ongoing discussion of what that telos might be. To get to the other questioner, Bernstein makes a very good point in his critical response to McIntyre. And that is that the big problem with McIntyre is that he thinks we can abandon modernity in its entirety. You know, we can make as if it never happened and return to Aristotle and all become Aristotelians. That is not good philosophy, that's not good theology, that's not good reflection. We are what we are because of the traditions that make us, the traditions. And the important thing is Habermas, not Habermas, what's this hermeneutical philosopher? Gadamer. The good point that Gadamer says is we think in terms of traditions, but there must be a reuptake of those traditions to not reach a point where we can draw a line through everything that has happened in the tradition and start anew, but where we can reuptake it. I don't know how to formulate that better. I don't know whether this helps you, but yeah.
Okay, so I'll start with the person here. What's the third question?
So it's over here. I like the way Professor analyzes different great leaders during the course of history. I just want to ask you, pick your brain on one of those questions. How would you see this too? Both Alexander the Great and Shaka Zulu were military leaders who expanded their influence through warfare and conquest. How would different ethical frameworks such as virtue ethics evaluate their leadership, achievement, and in the use of violence? Thank you so much.
Is there another question? Will you take another one? This one? Okay, there's one at the back.
If human dignity and rights to be known a particular understanding of human nature, what foundation remains for ethics when society can no longer agree on what a human being is? We're struggling to define what a woman is, going through different thinking patterns or foundational frameworks for how we define titles or pronouns for people. So, can ethics survive without a shared understanding? And what gives you hope on this topic when we are talking about the demise of ethics and morality?
Two questions.
Yeah, the short answer is I don't know. I am, but this is probably not something that I should admit to you. I am skeptical about the idea of a definitive ethos or a definitive telos. I'm in that sense. If I may be so much of a heathen, I'm a bit of a Habermasian, which is a German thinker that says that we must deliberate and reach a series of progressive settlements. I like that phrase. Nice phrase, eh? A series of progressive settlements in terms of what is acceptable and right and wrong. I mean, the American Constitution is a good example of such an interim, non-final settlement. The same goes for our own Constitution. Whatever badly people like Malema and so say about our Constitution is a settlement that has come. But settlement must be in between. It must be incomplete. Incidentally, that brings me to your question about Hegel. You refer?
Yes.
Yeah, you refer to Hegel. I mean, Hegel is a great thinker, not because he was right, but because his dialect. No, I'm very serious about that. The greatest thinkers, or some of the greatest thinkers, including Aristotle, that the tradition has yielded, are sometimes spectacularly wrong. Right? But that's what makes them intriguing. Take someone like Descartes, René Descartes. There isn't a thinker with whom I more disagree. So also Martin Versveld, here at Ike said, he disagreed almost with every word that he's written down. But in being wrong, we learn what is the right thing. In being wrong, we learn what is the right thing. And therefore we must highly respect people who are different from us. Sorry, but I mean, to get back to your question, I don't know, did I answer your question?
Yeah, what gives you hope? She asked what gives you hope.
What gives you hope? Well, I would say what gives you hope, it's interesting that the category of hope has re-entered philosophical discourse. Kant said there are three important questions that we deal with in philosophy. The first is, what can I know? So that brings the Kritik der reinen Vernunft and all the intricacies associated with the epistemological issue. What can I know? How must I live? That's ethics and politics and everything associated with that. But then the third question is, what can I hope? What can I hope? And that is a question that has been underestimated and not taken seriously enough in the Western tradition, not taken seriously enough. Richard Rorty is a current day thinker who's written a book called Philosophy of Social Hope. And he reintroduces the category of hope. His answer, not that I necessarily have a better answer, his answer is to optimize a democratic lifestyle. If we can only get the guy, the orange guy, Trump, is that his name? Trump? Get him with Netanyahu, which I really do not admire. Sorry for the Jews here, which I really do not admire. Just to start talking to each other as fellow human beings. But I don't know, that doesn't happen. So what gives us hope? The only way in which I can answer that question is from my personal commitment as a believing Christian. I think if one takes the gospel seriously, one has reason for hope. And hope is Reich Moltmann, if I'm not mistaken. Hope is not only associated with the expectation of heaven on earth, because heaven on earth is not something I think to be taken too seriously, but neither is it to be identified with hell on earth, right? With hell on earth. To get back to Hegel, Hegel's dialectic is exactly that process that says it is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And then the synthesis becomes the next thesis, or the next antithesis, for the next synthesis. That is remarkable. That reflects our life in the world. Our life in the world is a dialectical process of prosperity, of controversy, of outcome, and of starting again anew. Sorry that I don't have any more profound things to say to you about it, but I don't know.
Okay, I think we will call it a day there. Thank you so much, Prof. You can see we enjoy, and I think one of the outcomes or the aims of philosophy is to make us think. Yeah, we need to keep on thinking, we need to keep on wondering. But our next item is tea. So, and then we, as you know, after that we will continue. So let's give them a round